Inside the prison power struggle, how gangs secretly control life behind bars. Before we begin, remember this. The stories you're about to hear happened in the real world, inside real prisons where power doesn't always belong to the guards. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of true crime, make sure you subscribe, leave a like, and tell us what you think in the comments. Because what happens behind prison walls is often more dangerous than anything outside. The hallway lights inside Pelican Bay State Prison in California buzzed faintly in the early morning hours of July 2011. Correctional officers moved carefully through the security housing unit, known simply as the SHU, a place designed for the most dangerous inmates in the American prison system. These were not ordinary prisoners. Many of them were leaders of powerful prison gangs, organizations that had built secret empires from inside their cells. And on that morning something was wrong. Officer Daniel Matthews noticed it first. The silence. Normally, the SHU had its own rhythm. The distant clang of metal doors, muffled shouting from inmates, the occasional thud of someone hitting the steel bars in frustration. But that morning, entire sections of the unit had gone eerily quiet. When Matthews checked the meal slots along the tier, he found untouched breakfast trays. Dozens of them. Inside the cells, inmates sat silently on their bunks, refusing food. It wasn't random. It was organized. Within hours, prison officials realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. A massive hunger strike spreading through California's prison system. But the real question wasn't why the inmates were starving themselves. The real question was how. Because many of the prisoners participating were from rival gangs that had been killing each other for decades. The Mexican Mafia, the Aryan Brotherhood, the Black Guerrilla Family, and the Nuestra Familia, some of the most feared prison gangs in American history. Enemies. And yet somehow they were acting together. For prison officials, that raised a terrifying possibility. If these gangs had learned to cooperate, they could control far more than just their own cells. They could control entire prisons. And maybe even the streets outside. The investigation quickly focused on a handful of inmates locked deep inside the SHU. These weren't just gang members. They were shot callers, the hidden leaders who issued orders that could travel through prison walls using coded messages, legal mail, and whispers passed between cells. One name kept appearing in intelligence reports. Todd Ashker. Ashker was a founding member of the Aryan Brotherhood affiliate known as the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas. For more than 2 decades, he had lived in solitary confinement, locked inside an 8-by-10-foot concrete cell. Yet somehow, investigators believed he was still influencing gang activity across California prisons. Another name surfaced alongside his. Sitawa Nantambujama, a member of the Black Guerrilla Family, a gang with deep roots in political radicalism and prison organizing. And then there were leaders tied to Latino prison gangs, men connected to the powerful Mexican Mafia network. Prison officials were stunned. These groups had fought brutal wars for years. Murders, stabbings, assassinations ordered from inside prison cells. But intelligence reports suggested that something had changed. Somehow, these men had begun communicating with one another. And if they were coordinating the hunger strike together, it meant one thing. The prison gangs had formed a secret alliance. Investigators began combing through confiscated letters and coded messages. Most of them looked harmless at first glance. Discussions about books, family members, or prison conditions. But hidden inside the writing were signals. Numbers. Nicknames. Strange phrases that didn't quite make sense. To the trained eye, they were instructions. Orders. And as analysts began decoding the messages, a disturbing pattern emerged. The hunger strike wasn't just a protest. It was a demonstration. A way for gang leaders to prove something to prison authorities. That even in total isolation, they were still in control. But the deeper investigators dug, the more unsettling the picture became. Because some of the messages weren't about the strike at all. They were about violence. Specific inmates. Specific targets. And when officials finally traced one message to its source, they realized something chilling. The order for a murder had been issued from inside a solitary confinement cell. A place where the inmate had supposedly been cut off from the outside world for more than 20 years. And when investigators uncovered who the target was, they realized the power struggle inside the prison was only just beginning. By the time investigators confirmed the murder order, the atmosphere inside Pelican Bay had shifted from tense to explosive. Prison officials had always known gangs controlled parts of life behind bars. But what they were now uncovering suggested something far more organized. A shadow command structure operating quietly inside one of the most secure prisons in the United States. The order that had been intercepted was precise. It named a target. It described the location. and it included instructions that only someone deeply familiar with prison routines could have written. The disturbing part was where the message had come from. The security housing unit. A place designed to isolate gang leaders so completely that they could no longer influence the outside world. Yet somehow they still were. Investigators began retracing the path of the message. Inside Pelican Bay, communication wasn't supposed to exist between isolated inmates. Each prisoner spent 22 to 23 hours a day inside a concrete cell. Human contact was almost non-existent. But prison gangs had spent decades perfecting ways around those restrictions. They used coded language hidden in letters sent through attorneys. They passed notes during brief moments in exercise yards. They even communicated through the plumbing system, tapping messages through pipes that connected the cells. The deeper investigators dug, the more sophisticated the network appeared. The hunger strike had not started randomly. It had been planned for months. Authorities began focusing on a small group of inmates believed to be coordinating the entire operation. Among them was Todd Ashker, still sitting inside his solitary cell after more than 20 years. Another was Sitawa Nantambu Jama, whose writings about prison conditions had quietly circulated among inmates across the state. But the most surprising discovery was that these men were not acting as rivals anymore. They were acting as partners. At some point inside the SHU, leaders from 4 of California's most powerful prison gangs had made a decision that stunned investigators. They had agreed to stop attacking each other. For decades, gang rules had demanded constant violence between rival groups. A single insult or misunderstanding could trigger stabbings that spread across entire prison yards. But now, according to intercepted messages, the leaders had drafted something called the Agreement to End Hostilities. The document called for an immediate ceasefire between the gangs. No more retaliatory attacks. No more racial warfare. Instead, the gangs would work together. And the hunger strike was their first show of unity. At first, prison officials thought the agreement might reduce violence. But others feared the opposite. If the gangs were no longer fighting each other, they could focus all their power in one direction. Against the prison system itself. Across California, the hunger strike spread like wildfire. Within days, thousands of inmates across more than a dozen prisons refused meals. Entire housing units joined the protest. News organizations began reporting on it. Civil rights groups demanded investigations into long-term solitary confinement. Lawyers filed lawsuits on behalf of inmates. But behind the public protest, something else was happening. Prison intelligence units began intercepting new messages. And these messages were different. They weren't about prison conditions. They were about loyalty. Investigators noticed lists of names appearing in coded letters. Inmates suspected of breaking gang rules or cooperating with authorities. Inside the prison world, that label carried a deadly consequence. Informants didn't survive long behind bars. One name kept appearing again and again. A prisoner housed in another California facility. A man who investigators believed had quietly started speaking with authorities about gang activities. If the gangs discovered his cooperation, he would become a target. Officials moved quickly. They transferred the inmate to a different facility under protective custody. His identity was kept secret, and only a handful of investigators knew where he had gone. For a moment, it seemed like the situation was under control. Then, 3 weeks later, a report came in from another prison yard. An inmate had been attacked during recreation. Multiple stab wounds. A homemade weapon. When officers searched the area, they discovered something chilling carved into the weapon's handle. 3 letters. A gang symbol. It meant the attack had been ordered. When investigators compared the timing, they realized something terrifying. The attack had happened just hours after a coded message left Pelican Bay's security housing unit. A message written by a man who hadn't physically touched another human being in more than 2 decades. And as intelligence officers continued decoding the communication network, they uncovered something even more disturbing. The gangs weren't just coordinating inside California prisons anymore. Some of the messages were being routed through contacts on the outside. Which meant the prison power struggle wasn't confined behind bars. It was spreading into the streets. And somewhere in that growing web of communication, investigators discovered a message that made the entire case far more dangerous. Because the next target on the list wasn't an inmate. It was someone involved in the investigation. When investigators realized that someone connected to the case had been named as a target, the situation changed overnight. This was no longer just a prison intelligence investigation. It was a direct threat. The message had been buried inside a seemingly harmless letter sent through legal mail, one of the few communication channels inmates in the security housing unit were still allowed to use. At first glance, the letter talked about books, exercise routines, and everyday prison life. But hidden within the wording were coded phrases that prison investigators had learned to recognize. When decoded, the message revealed something chilling. A warning. A name had been mentioned in connection with interference. In prison gang language, that meant someone who was disrupting operations. And according to analysts, the person being referenced was a corrections officer working closely with the prison's gang investigation unit. Officer Luis Herrera had spent years tracking gang activity inside California prisons. He understood the coded language, the symbols, and the constantly shifting alliances that controlled life behind bars. But this time, Herrera had crossed a line the gangs couldn't ignore. He had helped investigators map the secret communication network operating inside Pelican Bay's SHU. Through months of analyzing letters, confiscated notes, and interviews with former gang members, Herrera and his team had begun connecting the dots. Messages written in solitary confinement were being copied and carried across prison yards. Those messages were passed to other inmates scheduled for release. Once outside, those individuals delivered the instructions to gang members on the streets. The chain of communication was complex, but it worked. Which meant prison gang leaders locked inside concrete cells still had influence far beyond the prison walls. And Herrera's work was starting to expose it. When the warning message was discovered, authorities didn't take chances. Herrera was quietly placed under protection while the investigation accelerated. Federal agencies began working with California's prison system, trying to dismantle the leadership structure that had formed inside the SHU. At the center of it all were the same figures investigators had been watching since the hunger strike began. Todd Ashker, Sidawa Nantambu Jama, and several other influential gang leaders connected to rival prison organizations. What investigators had slowly realized was something few people outside the prison system understood. The hunger strike wasn't just about prison conditions. It was about power. For decades, gang leaders had controlled violence inside prisons through fear and loyalty. But constant warfare between rival gangs made that control unstable. The agreement to end hostilities had changed everything. Instead of fighting each other, gang leaders were beginning to operate like a coalition. And that meant their influence could grow stronger than ever. Investigators feared that if the alliance held, the gangs could coordinate criminal activity both inside and outside prison with far greater efficiency. But something unexpected happened as the investigation unfolded. Public attention towards solitary confinement and prison conditions exploded after the hunger strikes made international headlines. Journalists began digging deeper. Human rights groups demanded reforms. And eventually lawsuits filed by inmates reached federal courts. One of those lawsuits would become Ashker versus Governor of California, a case that challenged the state's long-term use of solitary confinement. After years of legal battles, California agreed to sweeping reforms in 2015. Thousands of inmates were moved out of indefinite solitary confinement. The security housing unit system began to change. For prison officials, the reforms created new challenges. Some feared that releasing gang leaders from isolation could allow them to rebuild influence. Others believed the old system had only strengthened gang power by forcing leaders to organize secretly. Even today, experts still debate the outcome. But one truth remains undeniable. The events that began with a silent row of untouched breakfast trays in Pelican Bay exposed something the public rarely sees. Behind prison walls exists a hidden world, one governed by its own rules, alliances, and power struggles. A world where a message written in a concrete cell can trigger violence hundreds of miles away. A world where rival gangs can suddenly unite if it serves their interests. And a world where the battle for control never truly ends. Because years after the hunger strikes and the reforms that followed, prison investigators across the United States continue intercepting coded messages moving quietly through the system. Proof that even when the leaders are locked away, their influence doesn't disappear. It adapts. And if you think this story was intense, you're not ready for the next one. So make sure you subscribe, because the next case might reveal something even darker hiding behind prison walls.